The dawn broke cold and grey over RAF Hornchurch, Essex, England. February 1942. The kind of morning that seeped through wool and leather, settled into bones, and reminded every man on duty that winter still had teeth. Ground crews moved across the airfield like shadows, their breath forming small clouds that dissolved into the mist hanging low over the grass. Engines coughed and sputtered to life in the dispersal areas. The smell of high-octane fuel and oil mixed with the damp earth, a scent that had become as familiar as breakfast. Flight Lieutenant James Kellaway stood near the operations hut, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his flight jacket, watching the eastern horizon. 23 years old. Sandy hair that never quite stayed in regulation. Eyes that had seen too much in too short a time. He'd been flying Spitfires for 18 months now, and the mathematics of survival had become grimly clear. You either got lucky, got good, or got killed. Sometimes all three happened in the same sortie. The base was operational but subdued. The Blitz had ended months ago, but the war ground on with a relentless mechanical certainty. Pilots came and went. Some transferred. Some didn't come back. New faces appeared in the mess, eager and terrified in equal measure, trying not to stare at the empty chairs. The squadron had lost 4 pilots in the past 2 weeks, 2 over the Channel, 1 in a training accident, 1 to engine failure on takeoff. The numbers were being replenished, but the experience wasn't. Green pilots meant more risk for everyone. Kellaway's Spitfire MKVB sat 30 yards away, her Merlin engine ticking as it cooled from the morning test run. P-8332, painted with squadron markings and the letters JK on the fuselage. His personal aircraft. He knew every quirk, every tendency. The way she pulled slightly left on takeoff. The roughness in the throttle at 3/4 power. The loose rivet on the port wing that whistled above 12,000 feet. She wasn't perfect, but she was his, and in this war, that bond meant something. The operations officer emerged from the hut, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning the dispersal area. Wing Commander Ashford. Old for a fighter pilot at 36, but sharp, competent, and fair. He'd flown in the Battle of Britain and still bore a scar across his left cheek from a cockpit fire. He spotted Kellaway and walked over, boots crunching on the gravel. "Morning, James." "Sir." "Weather's lifting. We're expecting action today. Jerry's been probing the coastal convoys all week. Intelligence thinks they're planning something bigger." Ashford's voice was measured, professional, but there was an edge underneath. There was always an edge now. "Blue section will scramble first if the call comes." "You're leading." Kellaway nodded. "Blue section." Himself, Pilot Officer Harrington, a Canadian with 2 confirmed kills and nerves of steel, and Sergeant Dawson, 19 years old and 2 weeks out of training. A good kid, but untested in real combat. That was the section. 2 experienced pilots and 1 boy who still flinched at the sound of anti-aircraft fire. "Understood, sir." Ashford studied him for a moment, then lowered his voice. "Keep an eye on Dawson. He's eager, but eager gets you killed." "I will." The wing commander walked away, and Kellaway turned back toward his aircraft. The ground crew chief, Sergeant Mullins, was wiping oil from the engine cowling, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd been working on aircraft since before the war. He looked up and caught Kellaway's eye. "She's ready, sir. Topped off, ammo loaded, everything checked twice." "Thanks, Mullins. Bring her back in one piece, would you? I'm rather fond of this one." Kellaway managed a thin smile. "I'll do my best." The morning stretched on. Pilots played cards in the dispersal hut. Some read. Some slept in chairs, heads tilted back, mouths open, stealing rest when they could. The telephone sat silent on the desk, but every man's eyes drifted toward it. Waiting. Always waiting. The tension was a physical thing, a weight in the chest, a tightness in the jaw. At 0947 hours, the phone rang. Every head turned. The duty officer snatched it up, listened, scribbled notes. Blue section, scramble. Vector 090, Angels 15. Bandits approaching convoy off Margate. Go, go, go. Chairs scraped. Cards scattered. Men ran. Kellaway was already moving, sprinting toward his Spitfire, pulling on his helmet, fastening the oxygen mask. Harrington and Dawson were beside him, faces set, breathing hard. The ground crews yanked wheel chocks, shouted clearances. Engines roared to life, one after another, the Merlins screaming their 12-cylinder symphony. Kellaway climbed into the cockpit, strapped in with practiced speed. Instruments. Trim. Mixture. Throttle. The engine bellowed, and the Spitfire shuddered with barely restrained power. He glanced left, saw Harrington's thumbs up. Glanced right, saw Dawson's pale face behind the canopy. The kid looked terrified. Good. Fear kept you sharp. The three Spitfires rolled forward, gained speed, and lifted into the gray English sky. Wheels retracted with hydraulic precision. They climbed east, toward the Channel, toward the enemy, toward whatever waited beyond the clouds. The airfield fell away below, shrinking to toy-sized buildings and tiny figures waving from the ground. None of them knew that in less than an hour, only one of those aircraft would return. And when it did, every man on that airfield would fall silent. The three Spitfires punched through the cloud layer at 8,000 feet, breaking into brilliant winter sunlight that turned the white expanse below into a blinding ocean. Kellaway squinted, adjusted his goggles, and checked his instruments. Oil pressure steady. Coolant temperature within limits. Fuel sufficient. The R/T crackled in his ears, voices calm but urgent. Blue leader, this is Biggin Control. Bandits now bearing 085, Angels 12. Estimated 12 plus, mixed types. Convoy is under attack. Kellaway keyed his mic, Blue leader, Roger. Climbing to intercept. He pushed the throttle forward, felt the Merlin respond with a surge of power. The airspeed indicator crept past 250 knots. Beside him, Harrington maintained perfect formation, his Spitfire tucked in close, professional and steady. Dawson was wider, less confident, but holding position. The kid was doing all right. They climbed through 10,000 feet. 12,000. Kellaway scanned the sky, eyes moving in constant sweeps. High, low, behind. The sun. Always check the sun. That's where they came from. That's where death lived. His breath came steady through the oxygen mask, each inhalation slightly metallic, slightly chemical. At 14,000 feet, he saw them. Black specks against the blue, 8 miles ahead, lower and slightly south. A formation. Too far to identify, but the geometry was wrong for friendlies. His pulse quickened, adrenaline flooding his system, sharpening everything. Colors became brighter. Sounds became clearer. Time began to stretch. Blue section. Tally-ho. Bandits at 2 o'clock low, 6 miles. His voice was ice. Blue 2, visual. Blue 3, I see them. Dawson's voice was tight, higher than normal. Kellaway adjusted course, bringing them onto an intercept vector. The specks grew larger, resolved into shapes. Twin-engine bombers. Dornier do 217s, maybe 6 of them, flying in loose formation at 9,000 feet. And above them, weaving back and forth like hunting birds, a screen of fighters. Messerschmitt Bf 109s. He counted quickly. 6 fighters. The odds were exactly even, but the Germans had altitude advantage. Below and ahead, he could see the convoy, a dozen merchant ships crawling across the gray water, escorted by a destroyer and 2 corvettes. Smoke rose from one of the freighters. They were already under attack, bombs falling, waterspouts erupting around the vessels. Blue section, We take the fighters first. Clear them, then hit the bombers. Stay together. Blue 2, roger. Blue 3, understood. Kellaway rolled inverted and pulled, diving toward the enemy formation. Gravity pressed him into his seat. The Spitfire accelerated, the airframe trembling, the wind scream rising to a howl. 300 knots. 320. 340. The Germans grew from dots to aircraft to individual machines with markings and antennas and pilots inside them. The Messerschmitts saw them coming. The formation broke, scattering left and right, climbing and diving, transforming from a neat line into a swirling chaos of metal and speed. Kellaway picked a target, a 109 braking right, and hauled the stick over, following, cutting inside his turn. The gun sight reticle tracked across the sky. Leading. Adjusting. The Browning machine guns and Hispano cannon were armed, ready, hungry. The 109 pilot was good. He reversed, rolled, climbed vertically. Kellaway stayed with him, matching every move, closing the distance. 500 yards. 400. 300. The German's yellow-painted nose filled his windscreen. He could see the exhaust stains behind the engine, the black crosses on the fuselage. He squeezed the trigger. The Spitfire shuddered as 8 guns fired simultaneously. Tracers arced through the air, bright orange lines that converged on the target. Cannon shells exploded against the 109's wing root. Metal shredded. Smoke poured from the engine. The German aircraft snapped into a spin and fell away, tumbling, spiraling, gone. Blue 3 has a 109 on him. Kellaway's head whipped right. Dawson's Spitfire was in a desperate dive, a Messerschmitt locked onto his tail, gun flashes winking from its nose. Kellaway broke hard, pulled lead, fired a long burst. The 109 pilot saw the tracers and broke off, rolling away. Dawson leveled out, breathing hard over the R/T. Thanks, lead. I didn't see him. Check your 6. Always check your 6. The fight dissolved into a knife fight at altitude. Aircraft wheeling and diving, engines screaming, guns hammering. Kellaway worked purely on instinct now, reaction times measured in fractions of seconds. Pull, roll, fire, brake, climb. Another 109 flashed past, so close he could see the pilot's face, young and pale and terrified. He reversed, tried to track him, but the German was already gone, diving for the deck. Harrington's voice cut through the chaos. Blue 2, splash 1. Confirm 109 destroyed. Good kill, too. Below, the Dorniers continued their bomb runs, unimpeded now, dropping their loads on the helpless convoy. Kellaway saw a freighter take a direct hit amidships, fire erupting from her holds, men jumping into the freezing water. Rage flared hot in his chest. Blue section, form on me. We're going after the bombers. He rolled inverted again and dove, pulling the Spitfire into a near-vertical attack run. The lead Dornier grew massive in his sight. He walked the rudder pedals, adjusting aim, and fired. The guns roared. Bullets ripped into the bomber's cockpit, shattering glass, tearing through aluminum. The Dornier staggered, nosed over, and began a slow death spiral toward the water. Then everything went wrong. A sound like a hammer hitting an anvil. The Spitfire lurched violently. Warning lights flared red across the instrument panel. Coolant temperature spiking. Oil pressure dropping. Smoke pouring from the engine cowling. He'd been hit. Badly. Behind him, unseen until too late, a lone Messerschmitt had lined up the perfect shot. Kellaway's world narrowed to pure survival. Engine failing. Altitude bleeding away. The English coast 20 miles behind him. He keyed the mic, voice tight but controlled. Blue leader hit. Engines gone. Attempting to make it back. Harrington's voice, urgent. Blue 2, covering you. The Spitfire shuddered and bucked. Flames licked back from the engine cowling, orange tongues in the slipstream. Heat began to seep into the cockpit. Kellaway throttled back, tried to nurse the dying aircraft, but the Merlin was finished. Cylinder heads cracking. Pistons seizing. Oil spraying across the windscreen. He had maybe 5 minutes before it quit completely. And the channel was cold enough to kill a man in 10. The Spitfire was dying, and James Kellaway could feel every labored heartbeat of the engine through the control column. The Merlin coughed, sputtered, produced a sound like metal tearing itself apart. Smoke streamed back in thick black ribbons, obscuring his mirrors, filling the cockpit with the acrid stench of burning oil and melting rubber. The temperature gauge had climbed past the red line and kept climbing. He could feel heat through the rudder pedals now, through the floorboards, radiating up from the firewall that separated him from 1,200 horsepower of disintegrating machinery. He was 10 miles from the English coast, descending through 6,000 feet, and every second was a negotiation with physics and fate. "Blue Leader, what's your status?" Harrington's voice crackled through the R/T, tight with concern. Kellaway coughed, tasted smoke. "Engines finished. I'm on fire. Trying to make landfall. Blue 2 is with you. I'm on your 6. He glanced in what remained of his mirror, saw Harrington's Spitfire tucked in behind, a guardian angel at 300 yards. Dawson was somewhere above, covering them both, watching for German fighters that might smell blood and come for the cripple. But the Messerschmitts had broken off, probably low on fuel and ammunition themselves. Small mercies. The Merlin made a sound like a gunshot. The propeller windmilled uselessly, no longer pulling, just adding drag. Kellaway reached for the fuel cutoff, killed the engine completely before it could cook off and turn the whole aircraft into a fireball. The sudden silence was surreal, broken only by the whistle of wind through bullet holes and the groan of stressed metal. He was a glider now, a 1,500-pound glider with the glide ratio of a brick and flames still chewing through the engine compartment. 5,000 feet. The coast appeared ahead, a dark line against the gray water. Margate. Ramsgate. Somewhere in that vicinity. He couldn't afford to be picky. Any flat ground would do. Any airfield. Any open field. Anything. 4,000 feet. The flames were worse now, bright orange, consuming the engine cowling, beginning to eat back toward the cockpit. He could see them through the gaps in the metal, see the paint blistering and peeling. The heat was intense, making his face feel sunburned, making his eyes water. He had to get down. Soon. "Blue Leader, you're burning pretty bad. Consider bailing out." Harrington's voice was calm but insistent. Kellaway considered it. "Pop the canopy. Roll inverted. Drop free. Pull the ripcord and drift down into the channel. Hope the RAF rescue launches found him before hypothermia shut down his organs." But he looked at the coast ahead, looked at the altimeter, and made his choice. "Negative. I can make it. 3,000 feet." He crossed the coastline at 2,000, the white cliffs of the North Foreland passing beneath, achingly beautiful and desperately close. The Spitfire was shaking now, vibrating so hard his vision blurred. Something in the wing was loose, flapping, adding drag. He was losing altitude faster than planned, the glide angle steepening, options narrowing. He keyed the mic, "Blue Leader to begin control. Emergency. P-8332 inbound, engine out, on fire. Need immediate landing clearance anywhere available." The controller's voice came back instantly, professional and fast. "Blue Leader, Hornchurch is closest, bearing 270, 8 miles. Wind is light, runway 24 cleared for emergency landing. Fire crews standing by. 8 miles. 1,500 feet of altitude." The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. He'd make it, but barely. No room for error. No chance for a go-around. One approach. One landing. Get it right or die trying. He banked left, lined up on the heading, saw the airfield appear in the distance, a brown rectangle carved into the green Kent countryside, the control tower a grey finger pointing skyward. Home. So close. He trimmed for best glide speed, kept the nose down, conserved every foot of altitude like a miser hoarding gold. 1,000 feet. The flames had burned through to the cockpit now. His left boot was getting hot. He could smell his own leather jacket beginning to scorch. The instrument panel was dark, electrical system dead, but he didn't need instruments now. He had eyes, hands, instinct, and 20 months of experience keeping him alive. 500 feet. The airfield fence passed beneath. He was coming in fast, too fast, but he had no choice. No power to adjust. No engine to add thrust on final. Just momentum, angle, and timing. He could see people running on the ground, fire trucks racing toward the active runway, crews pointing up at him, at the burning aircraft limping home. 200 feet. The runway threshold rushed toward him. He pulled back gently on the stick, bleeding off speed, raising the nose. The Spitfire responded sluggishly, heavily, like a wounded bird fighting to stay aloft. He felt the change in air pressure, felt the ground effect cushion the descent. 50 feet. 20. 10. The wheels touched down hard. The aircraft bounced, settled again, rolled. He stood on the brakes, felt them grab, felt the tail drop. The Spitfire slewed left, he corrected with rudder, kept it tracking straight. Speed bled away. 50 knots. 40. 30. 20. The aircraft rolled to a stop 300 yards down the runway, flames now fully engulfing the engine, smoke pouring into the sky. Kellaway's hands were already moving. Harness release. Canopy back. He stood in the cockpit, threw his legs over the side, dropped to the wing, jumped to the ground. His knees buckled, he rolled, came up running, sprinting away from the burning Spitfire. He made it 30 yards before his legs gave out and he collapsed onto the grass, gasping, coughing, alive. The fire trucks arrived within seconds, foam spraying white arcs over the burning aircraft. Medics surrounded him, hands checking for injuries, voices asking questions. He waved them off. "I'm fine. I'm fine." But they weren't listening to him. They were looking past him, looking at the sky, looking at something behind him. He turned, still on his knees, and saw what they saw. Another Spitfire was coming in, trailing smoke. Blue 3. Dawson. The kid's aircraft was shot up, pieces missing from the tail, one aileron hanging loose. He was too low, too slow, the approach angle all wrong. Kellaway struggled to his feet, watching, willing the kid to pull it off. "Come on. Come on. You can do it." The Spitfire crossed the threshold. Touched down. Bounced hard. The landing gear collapsed. The aircraft slammed down on its belly, slid forward in a shower of sparks and tearing metal, spun 90 degrees, and came to rest at the runway's edge. Silence. Then the canopy flew back and Dawson climbed out, shaken but uninjured, standing on the wing of his wrecked aircraft. Relief flooded through Kellaway. 2 out of 3. They'd lost Harrington. Then he saw the third Spitfire. It was already on final approach, descending toward the runway, but something was terribly wrong. The aircraft was moving slowly, too slowly, nose high, nearly stalling. The landing gear was down, but the canopy was still closed. And as it came closer, as it dropped toward the runway in an almost surreal slow-motion descent, Kellaway saw the damage. The entire right side of the fuselage was shredded, torn open from cockpit to tail. The canopy was starred with bullet holes. The wing showed massive damage, fabric hanging in strips, spars visible through torn metal. This aircraft should not be flying. Should not be capable of controlled flight. Yet here it was, somehow staying in the air through sheer impossible will. It touched down gently, almost tenderly, rolled straight and true, slowed, stopped, and the entire airfield went silent. No one moved. No one spoke. Every man stood frozen, staring at that impossible aircraft sitting on the runway, its engine ticking as it cooled, its shattered frame held together by nothing but determination and grace. The silence lasted perhaps 10 seconds. 10 seconds that felt like 10 minutes, 10 hours, a slice of frozen time where the world held its breath and waited for something, anything, to break the spell. The Spitfire sat motionless on the runway, its propeller still, its engine silent, wisps of coolant steam rising from the radiator. The damage was catastrophic. Half the tail was gone. The right stabilizer was missing completely. Cannon shells had torn through the fuselage in a diagonal line, shredding metal, destroying structure, creating wounds that should have torn the aircraft apart in mid-air. James Kellaway stood 50 yards away, medics still hovering around him, and felt ice settle into his stomach. He knew that aircraft, knew those markings, knew that paint scheme. Blue 2. Harrington's Spitfire. But Harrington was dead. Kellaway had watched him go down over the channel, watched the Messerschmitt's guns find their mark, watched the Canadian's aircraft roll inverted and dive toward the water, trailing fire and smoke. He'd called it out over the R/T, voice flat with a numbness that came after watching another friend die. Harrington was gone. They all knew it. So what the hell was his aircraft doing here? The first person to move was Wing Commander Ashford. He strode forward, jaw set, face pale, walking toward the Spitfire with the measured pace of a man approaching something he couldn't quite believe. The fire crews followed, foam guns ready, faces uncertain. Kellaway forced his legs to move, forced himself to follow, Dawson appearing at his side, the young sergeant's eyes wide and confused. That's Blue 2, sir," Dawson whispered. "That's Harrington's plane." "I know." They reached the aircraft. Ashford climbed onto the wing, grabbed the canopy rail, and heaved. The shattered perspex resisted, jammed in its runners, but he pulled harder and it scraped open with a grinding shriek of damaged metal. Inside the cockpit, slumped forward against the control column, was Pilot Officer David Harrington. His face was gray, eyes closed, head tilted at an angle that suggested unconsciousness or something worse. Blood soaked the front of his flight suit, dark and wet, pooling in his lap, dripping onto the rudder pedals. His left hand still gripped the throttle, frozen there in a death grip. His right hand lay limp across his leg, fingers curled, wedding ring visible on the third finger. Ashford reached in, pressed 2 fingers to Harrington's neck, held them there. 5 seconds. 10. His face remained expressionless, but something flickered behind his eyes, something that looked like sorrow kept barely in check. "He's gone," Ashford said quietly. "Must have died on approach." A medic climbed up, double-checked, confirmed. "Yes, sir. He's dead. Looks like he took rounds through the chest, probably punctured a lung. Maybe the heart. He bled out in the cockpit." Kellaway stared at the body, at his friend's lifeless form, and his mind struggled to process what he was seeing. Harrington had been shot to pieces over the channel. The aircraft had been destroyed. Both should have gone into the water. But somehow, Harrington had kept flying. Had kept the shattered Spitfire under control despite catastrophic damage. Had made it across 20 miles of open water. Had found the airfield. Had lined up an approach. Had touched down perfectly. Had saved his aircraft even though it couldn't save him. And then, only after landing, only after the wheels touched ground and the mission was complete, had he allowed himself to die. "Jesus Christ," someone whispered. "He flew it back dead." "Not quite dead," Ashford corrected, voice rough. "But dying. He knew he was dying. Look at the radio." Kellaway leaned in, saw what the wing commander meant. The R/T switch was in the off position. Harrington had deliberately switched it off, had cut communication, had flown the last 20 miles in silence. He hadn't called for help. hadn't reported his damage, hadn't said he was hit. He'd known there was nothing anyone could do, so he'd simply come home. Brought his aircraft home. One last mission. One last perfect landing. The ground crew chief, Sergeant Mullins, appeared at the wing's edge, looked into the cockpit, and his weathered face crumpled. He'd maintained this aircraft for 8 months, had worked with Harrington every day, shared jokes and cigarettes and complaints about the weather. He reached in with a shaking hand and gently closed the dead pilot's eyes. "He shouldn't have been able to fly this," Mullins said, voice breaking. "The control cables are half severed. The rudders mostly gone. The elevators held on with 2 bolts and a prayer. He couldn't have had more than 20% control authority. Maybe less." "Then how?" Dawson asked, the question everyone was thinking. No one answered. There was no answer. Just the impossible fact sitting before them, the aircraft that shouldn't fly and the pilot who shouldn't have been able to bring it home but did it anyway. Ashford climbed down from the wing, stood in silence for a moment, then turned to face the assembled men. Mechanics, pilots, ground crew, medics, truck drivers, clerks, everyone who'd been on duty, everyone who'd heard the engines, everyone who'd watched the landing. His voice, when he spoke, was steady but quiet. Pilot Officer David Harrington, Royal Canadian Air Force, attached to 65 Squadron. 26 years old. Married. 2 confirmed kills. He died doing his duty, bringing his aircraft and himself home despite wounds that would have killed most men instantly. He flew for 20 miles with his chest torn open. He made a perfect landing while bleeding to death. And he saved His Majesty's Spitfire in the process. The wing commander paused, jaw working. "I don't know if that makes him incredibly brave or incredibly stubborn. Probably both. But I know this. Not one man here will forget what we just witnessed. Not one man here will ever doubt what a fighter pilot can do when he sets his mind to it." He turned to Kellaway. "James, you were his flight lead. You'll write the report. Make sure they know what he did." "Yes, sir." The medics gently extracted Harrington's body from the cockpit, placed him on a stretcher, covered him with a blanket. They carried him away toward the medical building, boots crunching on gravel, the procession slow and solemn. Men removed their hats as he passed. Some saluted. Some just stood with heads bowed. Kellaway watched them go, watched his friend disappear into the building that would serve as a temporary morgue, and felt the weight settle onto his shoulders, the weight that every survivor carried, the burden of being the one who lived while others didn't. He'd write the report. He'd make sure they knew. He'd tell them about the impossible flight, the dead-stick landing, the pilot who refused to quit until the mission was complete. Behind him, someone began to push Harrington's Spitfire off the runway, a tractor hooking onto the tail wheel, towing it toward the maintenance hangars. The aircraft left a trail of oil and coolant on the concrete, dark stains that would take days to wash away. Mechanics would strip it for parts, salvage what they could, scrap the rest. The airframe was too damaged to repair. But the Merlin engine might be saved. The guns could be remounted. The instruments reused. Nothing was wasted in war. Especially not courage. Kellaway walked slowly back toward the operations hut, Dawson beside him, both men silent. The airfield was coming back to life now, the stunned paralysis breaking, men returning to their duties, engines starting again in the dispersal areas, the machinery of war grinding forward. But something had changed. Something unspoken but deeply felt. They'd seen something today that transcended training, tactics, and orders. They'd seen a man defy death long enough to bring his aircraft home. That night, in the officers' mess, no one sat in Harrington's chair. They'd move it tomorrow, reassign the seat, let another pilot use it. But tonight it stayed empty. Tonight they toasted him with whatever liquor they could find, told stories about his terrible jokes and his skill at cards and the way he could nurse a damaged engine better than anyone in the squadron. They laughed at the memories and fell silent at the truth and went to bed wondering which of them would be next. James Kellaway lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind outside and the distant sound of aircraft on patrol. He thought about the morning scramble, about the fight over the convoy, about the flames in his cockpit and the desperate glide home. He thought about Dawson's collapsed landing gear and narrow escape. And he thought about Harrington, flying alone and silent across the channel, dying by inches, keeping the Spitfire level and true until the wheels touched English soil. He'd write the report tomorrow. He'd use the right words, the official language, the military terminology. But he'd never be able to capture the truth of what they'd witnessed. How do you describe a ghost flying home? How do you explain a dead man landing an aircraft with nothing but will and muscle memory and love for the machine that carried him? You couldn't. So you just wrote the facts, submitted the forms, and hoped someone, somewhere, understood what it meant. Outside, in the darkness, Harrington's Spitfire sat in the maintenance hangar, cooling and silent and empty. The mechanics had draped a tarp over the cockpit, covering the bloodstains, protecting what remained of a pilot's final seat. Tomorrow they'd begin the dismantling. Tonight they let it rest. On the runway, where the aircraft had touched down, the tire marks were still visible. 2 straight black lines on gray concrete, perfectly aligned, perfectly centered. The mark of a perfect landing. The last thing a dying pilot had given to the war effort, the final gift of a man who wouldn't quit until the job was done. The airfield slept. The war continued. And somewhere in the records of RAF Hornchurch, in a file that would gather dust for decades before historians found it, would be one line that said everything and nothing. Pilot Officer David Harrington, RCAF. Killed in action, February 12, 1942. Landed aircraft posthumously. Exemplary conduct. Recommended for commendation. 3 months later, his wife would receive the Distinguished Flying Cross on his behalf. She would hold it in her hands, this piece of silver and ribbon, and wonder what last thoughts had gone through her husband's mind as he flew those final miles. She would never know that he'd thought of her, of their wedding day, of the promise he'd made to always come home. And in his way, flying a broken aircraft with a broken body, David Harrington had kept that promise. He came home.